Hello everybody, I'm Pat,
I'm Melissa.
and welcome to our New Jersey Sews workshop on how to make an 18th century jacket. First, we need to gather together all the tools we're going to need. You're going to need your patterns that you pre-purchased. You're going to need measuring tools, scissors, two kinds, one for paper and one for fabric. You're going to need marking tools, everything, maybe chalk or pencils. You could use a dry erase marker. Maybe in high school you used something like this. I also use pins sometimes. You might need bias tape. Here's another piece. Some thread, and maybe some boning and some awls. Also, some of you may need tape. So let's get started, shall we? So let's take a look at our patterns. When you get your pattern, you're going to want to take it out of the bag, and you will notice that it either comes in a great big piece that you have to unfold, or if you got the downloadable pattern, you printed it out on 20 different pieces of paper. Both of these patterns need to be worked on to be able to get us to make a pattern from it. The big ones need to be cut down so that we use and collect only the patterns that we're going to need for this particular jacket. This one will eventually need to be cut down too. Now I like to call this a Franken pattern, like Frankenstein, because it's been sewn together kind of with tape. And there's a solution to that if you find this hard to deal with. So if you find it hard to work with this Franken pattern, what I do is I get old wrapping paper that I have hanging around the house. I lay it underneath the pattern. I carefully weigh it down with weights, and then I can cut a new pattern following the exact shape of whichever size I want to use, so that you end up with one piece of paper, not Scotch taped together, which is much easier to use. Of course, it's not unfolding too quickly. But what you want to do is make sure that you transfer any marks that you may think are valuable to you in the future onto that one pattern. But isn't that an easy solution? When you're cutting out your pattern, remember you're cutting paper, please use your paper scissors and not your fabric scissors. And in order for you to lay it flat on your fabric, you're going to need to iron it. Now, it's my suggestion to you that you actually iron it upside down with the printing facing your ironing board. I actually have a piece of scrap fabric here because what happens is the ink from the pattern has a tendency to bleed. So by doing it this way, we don't get any ink bleeding all over the pattern, making it look messy, and we don't get any of the ink bleeding onto our ironing board. So ladies, these are the three patterns that we're going to be dealing with. Our bedgown, the short gown, or the jacket with sleeves. Now each of these actually come with their own set of instructions, which should help you if you're finding me hard to follow. Also, there might be available information on YouTube, and we'll be posting on our blog site, NJDAR Sews 250 at wordpress.com. So these are the two patterns we're going to be dealing with. And why we're dealing with them at one time is because they're actually related. There are very few differences between these patterns. This one has a V-neck instead of a curved neck, and it's longer than the short gown, but they're basically the same. What they're called in history is a T-shaped garment. Now, a T-shaped garment is something that's found in every culture. Even Japan, that's where the kimono comes from. What this means is that you have one piece of fabric making your garment. It starts at your front hem, it goes up over your shoulder down to the back hem, and you put your arms out, and that is your T shape. So from side to side of your fabric, from end to end. Now this is our short gown pattern, and it probably came with extra pieces. I folded this one over for now just so that you can see how the sleeve lines up with the top edge of the jacket. And this is the extra piece that allows it to go over your hips easily. Now you're going to need 2 of these, one for each sleeve, and you're actually going to need 4 of those because you need 1 for each front side and 1 for each back side. Now these are our 2 patterns. They are untried for you, and if you're concerned about how they're going to fit you, I have a solution. Make a sample pattern. These 2 samples are made for each of these patterns, and I have to say, I made this out of an old sheet that I bought at my local Goodwill for $1. So this is not a huge investment of time or money. It's just simply figuring out whether it fits. Melissa has put on this sample that I actually made for myself. And believe me, Melissa is not my size. So you can see that it's quite commodious on her, and yet it still is very attractive. Now, what you might also notice is that I made a mistake. I'm not flawless. I put my pleats on the outside instead of on the inside. But what might be the most important fitting point on this jacket is this area here, because you want to make sure it hits your waist at the right point. Now we're ready to deal with fabric, but before we even think about cutting, I want to just find out if my pattern will fit all the way across my fabric, just like we talked about before. To do that, I'm going to do a quick cheat, and the cheat is to fold the fabric into quarters and to test it with my pattern. So the first thing we're going to fold are the 2 ends of the fabric together. Those would be the hem for the front and the hem for the back. And then I'm going to fold the 2 edges that are the selvage edges, which would be the 2 sleeve edges together. So quickly, as quick as folding that piece of fabric, we can test. Now, I have folded my big piece of fabric, or paper pattern, into right down the center line. The pattern has on this an instruction that's very important. Place on fold. This is my fold up here for my shoulder. That's where I'm going to place my pattern. And I'm also going to test to see how much sleeve I can get in one go. And look at that, we're almost to the very edge of what they recommend. And this would actually be the turned up cuff. So I'm very happy about that. I don't have to cut it as a separate piece. And what about that triangular piece? Well, look at here. I don't need to cut that as a separate piece either. All I have to do is either tape it down or weight it down, and I can cut these in one go. Now, you might notice, it's a little bit on the short side on my short gown. I'm not too concerned about that. If it's in short, it's not a big deal. This was just less than 2 yards of fabric to begin with. If you have 2 yards, it should not be a problem at all. Now we're about ready to lay out our pattern on our fabric, but I want to remind you of 2 things. First thing, on our last time, I told you to always mark the right side of your fabric. So I have put this little safety pin onto my fabric on the right side so I can always refer to it to know which one is which. So I'm not making things inside out. Secondly, I like to use weights to put my pattern in place. You can pin it, but pinholes kind of destroy your pattern over time. And if you don't have these fancy weights from the sewing store, these weights work just as well. So you can use those to weight down your pattern. Now, we are about ready to cut things, but first I want to show you that this pattern has a lot of information. It has information about the front of the garment and the back of the garment. The front with its center front slit opening and its curved big neckline, and the back with the shorter neckline and the pleats. Now, in order for you not to be confused, because that is kind of hard to deal with, we are going to actually cut this out on this cutting line as a separate pattern piece, and then very carefully label this as short gown back of neck. So now you see I've just cut the pattern. I haven't cut the material, but I have labeled it short gown back of neck, and I'm going to place it here where I know where it is and it's kind of out of the way for now. I'm ready to cut my fabric. I know this is the scary part, but it's not hard. I'm going to cut along this line here and then along the hem line, all the way around, put my old pattern over here, and then finish cutting out the same way that I cut this side. Oops. If your fabric was too narrow to get that extra sleeve extension on, don't forget that you can do that with the extra length of fabric that you might have for your pattern. The fabric amounts are, of course, listed on the pattern. So now we have to deal with the center front line, the line that goes from the hem all the way up to the neck edge of the front. Now, you can cut this pattern in two, which is not a problem, but it does make for a less stable pattern. But don't forget, if you're going to do that, to use your paper scissors on the paper. I personally am going to fold my pattern in half and use that fold edge as my guide. Put my weights back on top of it. Now, here is something very special. As I come over here, you can cut that if you want to. We are now going to cut the top edge of the fabric. Not both pieces of fabric, just the top piece of fabric. So be very careful that you cut only one layer. I also want to cut the neck edge for the front, and that too, I'm only going to cut one layer of fabric. gets a little tricksy cutting back around your shoulders. And I'm going to cut right up to that fold line. Then I'm going to fold back my pattern so I can do that other side just as easily. There. That is my front edge of my neckline. Actually be a little neater over here now that I've pulled that up. I can see my mistake. We do want them to be mirror images of each other. Now, what about the back of the neck? That's where this handy little pattern comes into play. You fold this out, you lay this back in place, put a couple of weights on it so it doesn't wiggle about, and cut out your back of the neck line too. Now you have the main part of your garment totally cut. Now, when I was able to cut my fabric because it was so wide, I could cut almost the entire sleeve out of my fabric in one go. But you'll notice this line. This line is for a cuff. And if I want to put that cuff on there, I can either choose to use the excess fabric that I've cut out from here, or I can do something different. And I've decided to do something different. I have this sweet little cotton, and I'm going to actually use that to make the ends of my jacket sleeve. My tan jacket is already cut and ready to go. But what if your fabric isn't as plain as my tan jacket is? What if it has a beautiful directional fabric like this that has flowers and they're growing in one direction, up? Well, if you try to make this with it on the fold, as we did this one, you will end up with your flowers growing up in the front and down in the back. So in order to cure that problem, you need to put in one extra seam. Instead of cutting this on the fold for the shoulder, you're going to need a shoulder seam. And you're going to want to make sure that you cut it with your flowers growing up in the front and your flowers growing up in the back and meeting at that shoulder seam, and that will just be one straight seam right across your fabric. Then you deal with it just the same way as we've done with this. I'm really mad at myself for marking that. We are going to deal with these pleat lines, and I've numbered them for your convenience. 1 and 2 are mirror images of 5 and 6. So we're going to deal with those guys first. The next step is to pin together these long pleats. You're going to start that by pinning top edge together. I'm going to go through on that line and then match it right on the line on the other side. And then put my pin in so it's solid. Ooh, that's not good. It always has to be on the line. There we go. Much better. I'm going to match it the whole way up. So give me a few minutes to do that. Now, we have pinned them, these two pleats, the ones that were 1 and 2, and the ones that were 5 and 6. And I've pinned them the whole way up, matching them on both sides so that they're right on where that marking line was. You can either hand sew this or you can machine sew it. I'm going to machine sew because I find it fast and easy. If you need to remember how to do the hand sewing stitches, please go back to the petticoat video and you'll find a how-to on how to hand sew seams. I will make sure that I do not sew over any of those pins. It's bad for my machine, bad for the fabric, and bad for the pin. So I will make sure that I back them out as I come near them. We've finished sewing the first pleat and the last pleat. Now we have to do the center pleat. Now it has the center back line running through it, and we can just fold on that line and hopefully our lines will line up beautifully, but I'll pin them in place so that I know they're perfect. I have to say the most important tool, other than scissors, needle, and thread when you're sewing, is a good iron. It's a very important process while sewing. And here's that center back pleat that we're going to treat specially. There we go. And you can see from the right side of the garment now how nice those pleats look now that they're pressed in place. I'll even press down a little bit further on the right side so that they have character. There you go. So having flipped it so that the right sides of the garment are touching each other, we're now ready to pin the two pieces together, the one piece. And we're going to pin along the seam line, and you have a 5/8 seam allowance for this garment. So you can either sew this seam by hand or you can stitch it by machine. It doesn't matter. And what you're going to do is start at the bottom, go all the way up around and to the end of the sleeve. Okay, ladies, as you're stitching your seams, just remember it is a 5/8 seam allowance. You need to line up so that you're making your 5/8 seam on your mark on your machine, or if you're doing it by hand, there are a number of ways you can do it. The easiest way is to draw a line at 5/8 inch and then stitch on that drawn line. You saw how well just a regular pencil marks most fabrics, and you can probably do that on the inside so that you can stitch right along that stitching line very easily. I'm giving you the options to either line this garment or hand sew the edges of this garment. If you're going to hand sew the edges of the garment, here's the easiest way to do it. You need to use your iron, and the first thing you're going to do is iron over 1/4 inch. That's your turn 1. Then you are going to turn it over once again, turn 2, and you can iron and pin that in place. So, just like this. And you can finish the garment just that easily by stitching a beautiful invisible, either blind stitch or a nice discreet hem stitch, to do that. The reason you're gonna do a hem stitch or a blind stitch is because this is the inside of your garment and your outside will be like this, and you don't want your stitches to show. Turn and turn again method for hemming the front edges and the hem of your jacket works wonderfully on straight things. It does not work so wonderfully on the curve of your neckline. And the deeper you go into the neckline and put stitching, the more it will show. That's why I said you could get bias tape that somewhat resembles the color of your garment. Honestly, if I'd had time, I would have bought something that was a little bit more discreet than this, but it will do. What we need to do is stitch it on the front side of your neckline. Obviously, I'm just using a sample here. This is not my full garment. And I would fold up the one side of this two-fold bias tape, and I will pin it in place in that fold area of the bias tape. And I will stitch right where that pin line is in that little fold area right there. Okay. Let me just throw a few more pins in and then stitch it down. Now you can again stitch this by hand or by machine.